Welcome to Pocket Economics, a guide to changing lives, our podcast about the ideas which are shaping the EBRD regions and beyond. I'm Jonathan Charles, and today we're discussing how corruption begets more corruption. The corruption of the best things gives rise to the worst, said the Scottish philosopher David Hume. But how do we define corruption?
Corruption involves the abuse of public or private office for personal gain. It includes bribery, that's the giving or receiving of a payment in order to influence the action of an official. We could say that corruption is any dishonest behavior by those in a position of power. This not only includes giving or accepting bribes, but also peddling influences, manipulating elections, or diverting funds from their intended purpose.
So, why do some people decide to act honestly and comply with the rules, and some others just don't? Do corrupt rulers generate corrupt citizens? These are some of the questions our guest, Nicolas Ajzenman from Sciences Po University in Paris, is seeking to answer in a recent paper, and he's here with us now. Nicolas, let me ask you first of all, would you agree with that definition we've just given? Quite a narrow definition of corruption.
Well, hi. First, thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm very glad to be here. And yes, basically I think that's a broad but a very accurate definition of corruption. I think corruption involves the public sphere, but also private and other organizations. But I think it's a good definition of corruption.
Now, in your recent paper, The Power of Exemplarity on How Corruption Spurs Corruption, in other words, people learn it off others almost, I guess, is what you're saying. They do what they see others doing. You use data from Mexico to measure the immediate impact of corruption on rules, on compliance and values. Could you tell us a bit more about what you found?
Yeah, sure. So let me first tell you a brief description of the methodology I use, because I think that's kind of important. So basically what I do is I take data from official audit reports of the federal government. Basically what they do is they go and perform some audits in some of the municipalities of the country. So basically I use this as an objective measure of corruption. Then what I do is I test if the release of these corruption reports has any kind of impact on people's behavior in terms of honesty. So to do that, I use basically two sources of information. The first one is, again, an objective measure of dishonesty, which is cheating rates on high school students. The second one is a more subjective measure, which is basically the result of a value survey where people report their self-perceived level of honesty and trust. And what I do finally is I test if in those particular municipalities and in those particular years in which corruption was actually published, there's a, let's call it, statistically unusual increase in dishonest behavior, which I measure with these two variables. So basically I have two main results. The first one is that as expected, in those municipalities in which the mayor was discovered being corrupt, which again I measure with this objective measure of corruption, people react by instantaneously changing their values towards honesty. So basically they start to agree more often with statements like, to get ahead in life you need to cheat, or laws were made to be broken, or I mean this kind of statements.
So just to be very precise about this then, what you found is that when ordinary citizens see their officials cheating, they in various ways think, well, it's okay for me to cheat as well, whether it's in school exams or other ways.
Yeah, exactly. So I think what happens, my main hypothesis is that you learn from the examples. So you know that in your society there are some social norms. So you basically want to comply with those social norms. But then when you realize that your leaders are corrupt, then you start to think that corruption is maybe not such a bad thing. So you as an adult change your own values, you transmit this to your own kids, and then your kids, as a consequence, start to be more dishonest.
So it's an erosion of morals in society.
Exactly, yeah.
Bit by bit, as they see examples of that.
Exactly, yeah. It's this is very, very consistent with this social learning kind of theories in which you learn from the example, you know what your leaders do, and you do the same. So it's kind of in that line.
Does it matter even if people started out thinking that their political leaders were good, and therefore had good. I mean, is it worse when they suddenly see they're not so good?
Exactly, yeah. So another interesting result that I find is that this effect is especially big in those municipalities where the government was perceived as transparent before. There's a survey that they do every, I think, 2 or 3 years. So I take the survey of 2007, and I showed that in those municipalities where people ranked the government that was corrupt as a transparent government, then the effect is bigger. So this is kind of a deception story.
Is it possible to compare what you found in Mexico to what we think is happening across the EBRD regions?
Well, yes. I mean, I think so. First, I think the EBRD region has been doing better. At least some of the country has been doing better. So if you compare some of the indexes of perceived corruption, 2016 and 10 years ago or 15 years ago, then there is a clear improvement. But there's still some space to catch up, particularly some of the post-communist country with the most developed countries. But yes, I mean, I think this is a general result in terms that culture matters. In Mexico, in the BRD countries, everywhere, one of the main reasons of corruption is that moral values are wrong. So I think it's definitely it also would work in these kind of countries.
And corruption can take many forms, can't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So again, I think corruption. So we usually think of corruption in terms of what the public sector does, which is of course.
We think of someone getting an envelope full of money and doing something as an official, but actually it's way beyond that.
Yeah, exactly. It's way beyond that. So you can find corruption in almost any organization, civil society, religious organization, NGOs, you name it. And this is the reason why I think culture is so important, basically because when you find that corruption is widespread, it's something systemic, then corruption is everywhere. It's not only what you said, taking the envelope in the public sector.
And what affects, do you think, the rate of corruption in society?
Well, so I think there are many bad consequences of corruption. We usually think about the most obvious and direct costs. For example, if you, as a government, need to build a school with the taxpayers' money, then if you take that money, you won't build a school, and that's a very obvious and direct effect. I mean, public services will be worse. But then there are many other not so obvious effects, which I think are as important as that. And again, the erosion of moral values is a more indirect, maybe more subtle effect, but still very important, precisely because when you start with that, when you start to erode the people's social norms, then it gets very widespread, and you can find this different type of corruption, as we said, in many different types of institutions.
And it really holds back economic growth, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the literature is very clear about this. Corruption has a very bad effect for growth, and we all know that.
You're listening to Pocket Economics, the EBRD podcast on how economic ideas help to change people's lives. And of course, we really want to hear what you think. You can contact us at EBRD on Twitter and on Facebook with the hashtag Pocket Economics. I'm Jonathan Charles. Today we're discussing corruption with our guest, Nicolas Ajzenman. And Nicolas, is there a consensus on which countries are the most corrupt around the world?
Well, there are some indexes which people used to believe in. Usually they are perception indexes. So you have, for example, this corruption perception index, which is made by Transparency, this very well-known organization.
Transparency International, yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
So there, for example, if you take a look to the EBRD countries, you can see that some of them rank quite bad. So, for example, the Balkans and countries like Kosovo, for example, rank in the position 26 out of 176 countries, meaning that it's in the top, let's say, 15 most corrupt countries in the world. And I think, generally speaking, these are good indexes, at least in terms of perception. It's not real corruption, it's not observed objective corruption, but as a perception index, I think it's very good.
What do you think makes the difference between success or failure when a country is fighting corruption? What distinguishes countries which really try to control this and countries which just don't and can't?
Well, I think there are many reasons why some of these policies work and some others do not work. Generally, I would say that those countries that improved in these kind of indexes, they basically increase the monitoring and punishment of public officials. So basically, you want to show with the example that being corrupt is not free. But then again, there are many things. There are many things you can do. I would go in that direction for sure.
Is it relevant whether a country is rich or poor in terms of how corrupt it is?
It is relevant. There's a clear correlation between poverty and corruption. That's for sure. What is not obvious is, of course, the causation. I mean, it can go in both ways, and it probably does. But anyway, I think there are many reasons to think that poverty generates corruption. To begin with, usually public officials in developing countries are paid very bad, and that's certainly a plausible cause of corruption. Second, the rule of law and punishment are usually more difficult to enforce in these kind of countries for many reasons. First, because it's more costly. Second, because they have like more settled elites. The separation of power there is not so good. So all these things are very bad, of course, for corruption. And finally, I think, when you take a look, for example, to surveys, you see that in poor countries they have different values towards corruption. So if you see the results in developing countries, usually people seem to be more against corruption than in the rest of the countries. And that's, again, we don't know if this is a cause or a consequence, but I think this certainly has an effect on corruption.
It's very difficult to fight in some countries. If I think back to some of the examples that we've had over the years where there's been a form of state capture, where the state, the corrupt administration is so corrupt, is earning so much money from it, gives it so much control over everything, that it's very hard then to fight that, because they have control of the judiciary, they have control of almost every lever that you might want to use. What do you do about that?
Exactly. So that's the real problem, because it's very difficult to implement good policies when they are not well implemented. Then they just don't work, and in those countries it's very difficult to implement those policies. But I think there are many things that could be done and that worked in many situations in many countries. So one of them, which I think is very important, is to encourage and try to help the countries to release all the data they have. This open data kind of movement is very, I think it's very revolutionary in a way, because basically what you're doing is you are kind of crowdsourcing the monitoring of the rulers. And I think that's a good way to start. When you open data and everyone knows what you're doing and then can control, like in real time, what you're doing, then I think that works. And I think that countries should be encouraged to do that. And EBRD and our institutions should also and can also encourage this kind of behavior.
You've raised that question of what the multilateral development banks, including the EBRD, can do. So is there more that can be done on corruption? Is there a role for the MDBs and the EBRD?
Sure, yeah. So to begin with, I think what I just said is, I think it's one of the important things. But then I think all these important organizations should lead by the examples. So basically, top management should be actively showing that integrity really matters. Because basically, people do what others do.
It's the small things, isn't it, actually, that are really important.
Exactly. So you have to do and you have to act, again, as I say, actively show that you care about integrity. It's not something, irrelevant. It's something that you really care about. And I think that's one of the most important things for these kind of organizations to do.
Are you hopeful? You spend a lot of time looking into corruption in various countries. Are you hopeful this is a battle where progress can be made? Because the evidence is not that encouraging.
Mm-hmm. I think I would say there's hope. I think if precisely if we can lead by the example, then things will start to change, because again, one of the most important determinants of corruption is corrupt moral values, and I think there's a lot of work that can be done there.
It's not a quick fix, though, is it?
It is not. No, it is not for sure. But I think, in my paper I showed that bad behavior spurs bad culture, but I think it also works the other way around. So I think there's a hope.
Nicolas, thank you very much indeed. Well, that's unfortunately all we have time for today. Meanwhile, you can share your thoughts with us at EBRD on Twitter and Facebook. Visit iTunes, SoundCloud and ebrd.com/podcast to download the previous episodes. And remember that reviewing and rating Pocket Economics, well, that helps others to find it. Please do it. Until next time, bye.